how to deal with unconscious people. This is a question that comes up quite frequently, and before we delve too deeply into that, I just want to acknowledge that for many of us, myself included, as we begin to awaken, we often find ourselves quite alone in that regard. That is, we may find that those around us, including our close friends and family, remain very much asleep. Not only that, but typically they show no interest in waking up and may even be adverse to it. And that aversion may also be extended toward our own awakening. That is, our awakening may seem to make some people a little uncomfortable. And with all that said, we may find ourselves not merely alone, but feeling rather alienated, finding ourselves surrounded by unconscious people. And it can often be very challenging because most people are not very conscious of their own behavior or how it affects others. Most people are self-absorbed rather than self-aware. And so this can bring about all sorts of tension and conflict. But as to this question of how to deal with such people, we really have to look at the question itself. We have to ask where this question is coming from, because the question suggests a problem that needs to be addressed. And what is that problem? To share from my own experience with all of this, and by the way, I've listened to many other people's experiences with this, and they're all very similar, but to share from my own experience, I recall one person in particular in my life who, although they were very well-meaning, they had a lot of unconscious behaviors that I found particularly irritating. And so every time I was around this person, I would find myself getting really irritated. And this person was very self-absorbed, always in their own head, always rambling on about trivial things which I had no interest in at all. The conversations were very much one-sided. They didn't really listen very well, and they had all kinds of other quirks that just seemed to agitate me in so many ways. But as I sat with that agitation and began looking deeply into it, what I came to realize was that this other person was not the cause of it. That agitation was rising up from within me, and as I traced it back down, what I found beneath it was a great deal of disappointment and frustration in regard to many things in life. Too many things to go into here. So what I had come to recognize was that this feeling of irritation was very much an unconscious reaction, which was arising from underlying feelings of frustration. And even though some of that frustration was in regard to this other person, most of it had very little or nothing to do with them. So in other words, my irritability was something that was always there inside of me, but certain people, like this person, seemed to do all the right things to trigger it. And if you just observe human beings in general, we all have this tendency to be reactive with one another. Whenever someone does something or says something, there's usually an automatic reaction to it that happens without any conscious thought or reflection. And so when we're around someone who we consider as unconscious, and we find ourselves feeling frustrated or irritated or angry or upset or whatever it happens to be, what it really comes down to is that our reaction itself is quite unconscious. It's just that unconscious automatic reaction. And it's due to something within us that we're not fully aware of. Something that we have not yet fully acknowledged and resolved in ourselves. So when we talk about how can we deal with unconscious people, what we really need to give attention to is our own reactivity, to bring awareness to those areas within ourselves where we are still unconscious. There is this tendency to think that there are conscious and unconscious people, or people who are asleep and those who are awake, as if there's a clear-cut division between the two. But in actuality, for most of us, awakening is a gradual ongoing process. We might have some initial awakening experience, but it's usually just the beginning, and there's still a lot more waking up to do. We become more conscious than we were previously, but there may still be many areas within us where we're still deeply unconscious. And so, in some sense, the people that show up in our lives, or who may already be a part of our lives, that trigger these reactions in us, we can come to see that as an opportunity to become more conscious, to awaken all the more. So when someone triggers some emotional reaction in us, that's an opportunity for us to look within ourselves and find out where that reaction is arising from. What's really the cause of it? Our unconscious tendency is to think that the other person is the cause of it. But as we become more conscious of our own internal mechanisms, we come to recognize that they're just doing what they do. And yes, their behavior may be unconscious, but it's not the cause of our emotional reaction. So when we're dealing with difficult people, rather than focusing on that person and what they're doing, can we shift our focus onto our own reactivity? And as we become more conscious of our own reactivity, and as we come to resolve it more and more, what we will find is that naturally we will begin to respond differently. We become less reactive, or perhaps in some cases, not reactive at all. Once you really begin to resolve that underlying emotion, there's not much there to get triggered. And so when that person is behaving in whatever way that used to trigger that emotion, instead you're simply there as a witness to it. You're simply present with the situation, undisturbed by it. And to some degree, if you're not reactive, if you're able to stay centered and present and calm, that will tend to have an influence on the other person. So if the other person is, well, let's say that they're angry. So if they're angry and you react to that with your own anger, what tends to happen is that they then react to your anger by becoming even more angry. And then you get more angry, and the whole thing just escalates. But if they get angry and you're not reactive to it, if you're calm and centered, and I mean genuinely calm, not that you're simply withholding your anger, but that there's only stillness in you, and so you're genuinely calm in the face of their anger, the other person may begin to feel more calm in your presence, and so their anger begins to diminish. And so as we become more conscious in this way, our very presence will begin to have an influence on those around us. And perhaps to some degree, they may even become more conscious. Because if they're angry and you're not reacting to it, or perhaps you're responding to them with understanding and compassion, then they might stop for a moment and begin to reflect on their own reactivity, becoming a little more conscious of it, which means that they're becoming a little more conscious. Even if it's just a little bit, every little bit makes all the difference. And so really, when it comes to this whole issue of how to deal with unconscious people, what we really need to look at is our own unconscious reactions. It's really an opportunity for self-reflection and greater self-awareness. It's an opportunity to ask ourselves, what do I need to be more conscious of in myself? If you find value in this content, be sure to like, share, and subscribe.